Section 15 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel, Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Madame Swann at Home, Part 15. In that quarter, then looked upon as remote, of a Paris darker than Paris is today, where even in the centre there was no electric light in the public thoroughfares, and very little in private houses. The lamps of a drawing-room situated on the ground level, or but slightly raised above it, as were the rooms in which Madame Swann generally received her visitors, were enough to lighten the street, and to make the passer-by raise his eyes, connecting with their glow, as with its apparent though hidden cause, the presence outside the door of a string of smart bromans. This passer-by was led to believe, not without a certain emotion, that a modification had been effected in this mysterious cause, when he saw one of the carriages begin to move. But it was merely a coachman, who, afraid of his horses catching cold, started them now and again on a brisk walk, all the more impressive because the rubber-tiled wheels gave the sound of their hoofs a background of silence from which it stood out more distinct and more explicit. The winter garden, of which in those days the passer-by generally caught a glimpse, in whatever street he might be walking, if the drawing-room did not stand too high above the pavement, is to be seen today only in photogravures in the gift books of P.J. Stahl, where, in contrast to the infrequent floral decorations of the Louis XVI drawing-rooms now in fashion, a single rose or a Japanese iris in a long-necked vase of crystal, into which it would be impossible to squeeze a second, it seems, because of the profusion of indoor plants which people had then, and of the absolute want of style in their arrangement, as though it must have responded in the ladies whose houses it adorned to some living and delicious passion for botany, rather than to any cold concern for lifeless decoration. It suggested to one, only on a larger scale, in the houses of those days, those tiny, portable hot-houses, laid out on New Year's morning beneath the lighted lamp, for the children were always too impatient to wait for daylight. Among all the other New Year's presents, but the loveliest of them all, consoling them with its real plants which they could tend as they grew for the bareness of the winter soil. And even more than those little houses themselves, those winter gardens were like the hot house that the children could see there at the same time, portrayed in a delightful book, another of their presents, and one which, for all that it was given not to them but to Mademoiselle Lily, the heroine of the story, enchanted them to such a pitch that even now, when they are almost old men and women, they ask themselves whether, in those fortunate years, winter was not the loveliest of the seasons. And inside there, beyond the winter garden, through the various kinds of arborescence which from the street made the lighted window appear like the glass front of one of those children's playthings, pictured or real, the passer-by, drawing himself up on tiptoe, would generally observe a man in a frock-coat, a gardenia or a carnation in his buttonhole, standing before a seated lady, both vaguely outlined, like two intaglios cut in a topaz, in the depths of the drawing-room atmosphere clouded by the samovar, then a recent importation, with steam which may very possibly be escaping from it still today, but to which, if it does, we are grown so accustomed now that no one notices it. Madame Swann attached great importance to her tea. She thought that she showed her originality and expressed her charm when she said to a man, "You will find me home any day fairly late. Come to tea," so that she allowed a sweet and delicate smile to accompany the words which she pronounced with a fleeting trace of English accent, and which her listener duly noted, bowing solemnly in acceptance, as though the invitation had been something important and uncommon which commanded deference and required attention. There was another reason, apart from these given already, for the flowers having more than a merely ornamental part in Madame Swann's drawing-room, and this reason pertained not to the period, but in some degree to the former life of Odette. A great courtesan, such as she had been, lives largely for her lovers, that is to say at home, which means that she comes in time to live for her home. The things that one sees in the house of a respectable woman, things which may of course appear to her also to be of importance, are those which are in any event of the utmost importance to the courtesan. The culminating point of her day is not the moment in which she dresses herself for all the world to see, but that in which she undresses herself for a man. She must be as smart in her wrapper, in her nightgown, as in her outdoor attire. Other women display their jewels, but as for her, she lives in the intimacy of her pearls. This kind of existence imposes on her as an obligation, and ends by giving her a fondness for luxury which is secret, that is to say, which comes near to being disinterested. Madame Swann extended this to include her flowers. There was always beside her chair an immense bowl of crystal filled to the brim with Parma violets or with long white daisy petals scattered upon the water, which seemed to be testifying, in the eyes of the arriving guest, to some favorite and interrupted occupation, such as the cup of tea which Madame Swann would, for her own amusement, have been drinking there by herself, an occupation more intimate still, and more mysterious. So much so that one felt oneself impelled to apologize on seeing the flowers exposed there by her side, as one would have apologized for looking at the title of the still open book which would have revealed to one what had just been read by, and so perhaps what was still in the mind of Odette. And unlike the book, the flowers were living things. It was annoying when one entered the room to pay Madame Swann a visit, to discover that she was not alone, or if one came home with her, not to find the room empty, so prominent a place in it, enigmatic and intimately associated with hours in the life of their mistress, of which one knew nothing, did those flowers assume, which had not been made ready for Odette's visitors, but, as it were, forgotten there by her, had held and would hold with her again private conversations which one was afraid of disturbing, the secret of which one tried in vain to read, fastening one's eyes on the moist purple, the still liquid water-color of the Parma violets. By the end of October, Odette would begin to come home with the utmost punctuality for tea, which was still known at that time as 5 o'clock tea, having once heard it said, and being fond of repeating, that if Madame Verdurin had been able to form a salon, it was because people were always certain of finding her home at the same hour. She imagined that she herself had one also, of the same kind, but freer, senza rigore, as she used to say. She saw herself figuring thus as a sort of l'Espinasse, and believed that she had founded a rival salon by taking from the deux de fond of the little group several of her most attractive men, notably Swann himself, who had followed her in her secession and into her retirement, according to a version for which one can understand that she had succeeded in gaining credit among her more recent friends, ignorant of what had passed, though without convincing herself. But certain favorite parts are played by us so often before the public and rehearsed so carefully when we are alone that we find it easier to refer to their fictitious testimony than to that of a reality which we have almost entirely forgotten. On days on which Madame Swann had not left the house, one found her in a wrapper of crêpe de chine, white as the first snows of winter, or it might be, in one of those long pleated garments of mousseline de soie, which seem nothing more than a shower of white or rosy petals, and would be regarded today as hardly suitable for winter, though quite wrongly. For these light fabrics and soft colors gave to a woman, in the stifling warmth of the drawing-rooms of those days, with their heavily curtained doors, rooms of which the most effective thing that the society novelists of the time could find to say was that they were exquisitely cushioned, the same air of coolness that they gave to the roses which were able to stay in their room there by her side, despite the winter, in the glowing flesh tints of their nudity, as though it were already spring. By reason of the muffling of all sound in the carpets, and of the remoteness of her cozy retreat, the lady of the house, not being apprised of your entry as she is today, would continue to read almost until you were standing before her chair, which enhanced still further that sense of romantic, that charm of a sort of secret discovery, which we find today in the memory of those gowns, already out of fashion even then, which Madame Swann was perhaps alone in not having discarded, and which gives us the feeling that the woman who wore them must have been the heroine of a novel, because most of us have scarcely set eyes on them outside the pages of certain of Henri Gréville's tales. Odette had at this time in her drawing-room, when the winter began, chrysanthemums of enormous size, and of a variety of colors such as Swann in the old days certainly never saw in her drawing-room in the Rue La Pérouse. My admiration for them, when I went to pay Madame Swann one of those melancholy visits, during which, prompted by my sorrow, I discovered in her all the mystical poetry of her character as the mother of that Gilbert to whom she would say on the morrow, "Your friend came to see me yesterday," sprang no doubt from my sense that, rose pale like the Louis XIV silk that covered her chairs, snow white like her crêpe de chine wrapper, or of a metallic red like her samovar, they superimposed upon the decoration of the room another, a supplementary scheme of decoration, as rich, as delicate in its coloring, but one which was alive and would last for a few days only. But I was touched to find that these chrysanthemums appeared less ephemeral than, one might almost say, lasting, when I compared them with the tones, as pink, as coppery, which the setting sun so gorgeously displays amid the mists of a November afternoon, and which, after seeing them, before I had entered the house, fade from the sky, I found again inside, prolonged, transposed on to the flaming palette of the flowers. Like the fires caught and fixed by a great colorist from the impermanence of the atmosphere and the sun, so that they should enter and adorn a human dwelling, they invited me, those chrysanthemums, to put away all my sorrows, and to taste with a greedy rapture during that tea time the two fleeting joys of November, of which they set ablaze all around me the intimate and mystical glory. Alas, it was not in the conversations to which I must listen that I could hope to attain to that glory. They had but little in common with it. Even with Madame Cottard, and although it was growing late, Madame Swann would assume her most caressing manner to say, "Oh no, it's not late, really. You mustn't look at the clock. That's not the right time. It's stopped. You can't possibly have anything else to do now. Why be in such a hurry?" As she pressed a final tartlet upon the professor's wife, who was gripping her card case in readiness for flight. "One simply can't tear oneself away from this house," observed Madame Bontemps to Madame Swann, while Madame Cottard, in her astonishment at hearing her own thought put into words, exclaimed, "Why, that's just what I always say myself, when I tell my own little judge in the court of conscience," winning the applause of the gentlemen from the Jockey Club, who had been profuse in their salutations, as though confounded at such an honour's being done them, when Madame Swann had introduced them to this common and by no means attractive little woman, who kept herself, when confronted with Odette's brilliant friends, in reserve, if not on what she called the defensive, for she always used stately language to describe the simplest happenings. "I should never have suspected it," was Madame Swann's comment. "3 Wednesdays running you've played me false." "That's quite true, Odette. It's simply ages. It's an eternity since I saw you last. You see, I plead guilty, but I must tell you," she went on with a vague suggestion of outraged modesty, for although a doctor's wife, she would never have dared speak without periphrasis of rheumatism or of a chill on the kidneys, "that I've had a lot of little troubles, as we all have, I dare say, and besides that I've had a crisis among my masculine domestics. I'm sure I'm no more imbued with a sense of my own authority than most ladies, still I've been obliged, just to make an example, you know, to give my Vatel notice. I believe he was looking out anyhow for a more remunerative place. But his departure nearly brought about the resignation of my entire ministry. My own maid refused to stay in the house a moment longer. Oh, we have had some Homeric scenes. However, I held fast to the reins through thick and thin. The whole affair has been a perfect lesson, which won't be lost on me, I can tell you. I'm afraid I'm boring you with all these stories about servants, but you know as well as I do what a business it is when one is obliged to set about rearranging one's household. Aren't we to see anything of your delicious child?" she wound up. "No, my delicious child is dining with a friend," replied Madame Swann, and then, turning to me, "I believe she's written to you, asking you to come and see her tomorrow. And your babies," she went on to Madame Cottard. I breathed a sigh of relief. These words by which Madame Swann proved to me that I could see Gilbert whenever I chose gave me precisely the comfort which I had come to seek, and which at that time made my visits to Madame Swann so necessary. "No, I'm afraid not. I shall write to her anyhow this evening. Gilbert and I never seem to see one another now," I added, pretending to attribute our separation to some mysterious agency, which gave me a further illusion of being in love, supported as well by the affectionate way in which I spoke of Gilbert and she of me. "You know she's simply devoted to you," said Madame Swann. "Really, won't you come tomorrow?" Suddenly my heart rose on wings. The thought had just struck me. After all, why shouldn't I, since it's her own mother who suggests it? But with the thought I fell back into my old depression. I was afraid now, lest, when she saw me again, Gilbert may think that my indifference of late had been feigned, and it seemed wiser to prolong our separation. During these asides Madame Bontemps had been complaining of the insufferable dullness of politicians' wives, for she pretended to find everyone too deadly or too stupid for words, and to deplore her husband's official position. Do you mean to say you can shake hands with 50 doctors' wives like that, one after the other?" she exclaimed to Madame Cottard, who, unlike her, was full of the kindest feelings for everybody, and of determination to do her duty in every respect. "Ah, you're a law-abiding woman. You see, in my case, at the ministry, don't you know, I simply have to keep it up, of course. It's too much for me, I can tell you. You know what those officials' wives are like. It's all I can do not to put my tongue out at them. And my niece Albertine is just like me. You really wouldn't believe the impudence that girl has. Last week on my day, I had the wife of the Under Secretary of State for Finance, who told us that she knew nothing at all about cooking. But surely, ma'am, my niece chipped in with her most winning smile, you ought to know everything about it after all the dishes your father had to wash. Oh, I do love that story. I think it's simply exquisite, cried Madame Swann. But certainly on the doctor's consultation day you should make a point of being at home, among your flowers and books and all your pretty things, she urged Madame Cottard. Straight out like that, bang, right in the face, bang. She made no bones about it, I can tell you. And she'd never said a word to me about it, the little wretch. She's as cunning as a monkey. You are lucky to be able to control yourself. I do envy people who can hide what is in their minds. But I've no need to do that, Madame Bontemps. I'm not so hard to please, Madame Cottard gently expostulated. For one thing, I'm not in such a privileged position, she went on, slightly raising her voice, as was her custom, as though she were underlining the point of her remark, whenever she slipped into the conversation any of those delicate courtesies, those skilful flatteries which won her the admiration and assisted the career of her husband. And besides, I'm only too glad to do anything that can be of use to the professor. But, my dear, it isn't what one's glad to do, it's what one is able to do. I expect you're not nervous. Do you know, whenever I see the war minister's wife making faces, I start copying her at once. It's a dreadful thing to have a temperament like mine. To be sure, yes, said Madame Cottard. I've heard people say that she had a twitch. My husband knows someone who occupies a very high position, and it's only natural when gentlemen get talking together. And then, don't you know, it's just the same with the chief of the registry. He's a hunchback. Whenever he comes to see me, before he's been in the room 5 minutes, my fingers are itching to stroke his hump. My husband says I'll cost him his place. What if I do? A fig for the ministry. Yes, a fig for the ministry. I should like to have that printed as a motto on my notepaper. I can see I am shocking you. You're so frightfully proper, but I must say there's nothing amuses me like a little devilry now and then. Life would be dreadfully monotonous without it. And she went on talking about the ministry all the time as though it had been Mount Olympus. To change the conversation, Madame Swann turned to Madame Cottard. But you're looking very smart today. Red fern facite? No, you know I always swear by Routhnitz. Besides, it's only an old thing I've had done up. Not really. It's charming. Guess how much? No, change the first figure. You don't say so. Why, that's nothing. It's given away. 3 times that at least I should have said. You see how history comes to be written, apostrophized the doctor's wife, and pointing to a neck ribbon which had been a present from Madame Swann. Look, Odette, do you recognize this? Through the gap between a pair of curtains a head peeped with ceremonious deference, making a playful pretense of being afraid of disturbing the party. It was Swann. Odette, the Prince d'Agrigente, is with me in the study. He wants to know if he may pay his respects to you. What am I to tell him? Why, that I shall be delighted, Odette would reply, secretly flattered, but without losing anything of the composure which came to her all the more easily, since she had always, even in her fast days, been accustomed to entertain men of fashion. Swann disappeared to deliver the message, and would presently return with the prince, unless in the meantime Madame Verdurin had arrived. When he married Odette, Swann had insisted on her ceasing to frequent the little clan. He had several good reasons for this stipulation, though had he none he would have made it just the same, in obedience to a law of ingratitude which admits no exception, and proves that every go-between is either lacking in foresight or else singularly disinterested. He had conceded only that Odette and Madame Verdurin might exchange visits once a year, and even this seemed excessive to some of the faithful, indignant at the insult offered to the mistress, who for so many years had treated Odette, and even Swann himself, as the spoiled children of her house. For if it contained false brethren who failed upon certain evenings in order that they might secretly accept an invitation from Odette, ready, in the event of discovery, with the excuse that they were curious to meet Bergot, although the mistress assured them that he never went to the Swans, and even if he did, had no vestige of talent really, in spite of which she was making the most strenuous efforts, to quote one of her favorite expressions, to attract him. The little group had its diehards also, and these, though ignorant of those conventional refinements which often dissuade people from the extreme attitude one would have liked to see them adopt in order to annoy someone else, would have wished Madame Verdurin, but had never managed to prevail upon her to sever all connection with Odette, and thus deprive her of the satisfaction of saying, with a mocking laugh, "We go to the mistresses very seldom now, since the schism. It was all very well while my husband was still a bachelor, but when one is married, you know, it isn't always so easy. If you must know, Monsieur Swann can't abide old Ma Verdurin, and he wouldn't much like the idea of my going there regularly, as I used to. And I, as a dutiful spouse, don't you see?" Swann would accompany his wife to their annual evening there, but would take care not to be in the room when Madame Verdurin came to call. And so, if the mistress was in the drawing-room, the Prince de Agrigente would enter it alone. Alone, too, he was presented to her by Odette, who preferred that Madame Verdurin should be left in ignorance of the names of her humbler guests, and so might, seeing more than one strange face in the room, be led to believe that she was mixing with the cream of the aristocracy, a device which proved so far successful that Madame Verdurin said to her husband that evening with profound contempt, "Charming people, her friends. I met all the fine flower of the reaction." Odette was living, with respect to Madame Verdurin, under a converse illusion. Not that the latter's salon had ever begun at that time to develop into what we shall one day see it to have become. Madame Verdurin had not yet reached the period of incubation in which one dispenses with one's big parties, where the few brilliant specimens recently acquired would be lost in too numerous a crowd, and prefers to wait until the generative force of the 10 righteous whom one has succeeded in attracting shall have multiplied those 10 70-fold. End of section 15.